You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, who's to blame for soaring gas prices? The British public says profiteering energy companies, the Russian government and growing global demand. Climate change threatens the future of the Winter Olympics as rising temperatures create a greater need for artificial snow. And an endangered monkey and a large-headed frog are amongst 224 new species discovered in Southeast Asia. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. Energy companies focused on their profits, the Russian government and growing global demand are what the British public feel is causing gas prices to soar. A survey by the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit think tank, provided exclusively to Sky News, also finds that the vast majority of the public do not support removing green levies from energy bills to help consumers cope with rocketing fuel prices. Well, the survey found that more than a third of the public blame energy company profiteering for gas price rises. Nearly a third thought the Russian government reducing gas supplies to Europe was the key driver, and 28% blamed increasing global demand. Well, our correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter joins us now from southwest London. And Hannah, so interesting to see who the public blames for rising energy prices. But does this survey give us any insight in what they'd like done about it?
Some very clear insight, actually, into what the British public think should be done and shouldn't be done. Interesting that only 13% think that removing green levies from energy bills is the right answer, although, of course, there is lots of support for removing VAT from energy bills. Half of those questions said that the best option was to decrease reliance on gas by using more renewable energy and better insulating homes. And this is really interesting, this bit, there was a broad support for the UK's net zero target, but nearly a third of people agreed with the statement, we can't afford to implement policies intended to address climate change. Now, that is the thing that's going to catch the eye of those tasked with delivering net zero. It's the thing, one of the many things that keeps them up at night, because although poll after poll has showed that there's really solid public support up and down the country for tackling climate change and getting to net zero, there is also now growing concern amidst a cost of living crisis that people aren't going to be able to find the money they need to invest in going green because the government can't possibly cover the cost for everybody in the coming 10 to 15 years. It might have to raise taxes, might have to reduce public spending. And yes, there is at this point a tacit acknowledgement that consumers are going to have to go into their own pockets, and that delicate mix is going to have to be executed really excellently to keep the public with the government, keep that support coming for net zero targets. Politicians trying really, really hard to make sure that that support doesn't evaporate.
Hannah, thanks very much. Now, climate change is threatening the future of the Winter Olympics and other sporting events as rising temperatures create a greater need for artificial snow. The Beijing Olympics, which get going next week, will be the first Winter Games to use almost 100% fake snow. But experts warn this can be bad for the environment as well as the competitors. Our sports correspondent Tom Parmenter has more.
This is the bobsleigh run at Bath University, and it's how you train for snow sports and winter sports when you don't have ice and snow, because you don't here in Somerset. But the Winter Games is going to be quite unusual because it will be the first Winter Olympics where they're relying on 100% artificial snow. And that has raised lots of questions from athletes who are concerned about the higher ice content that you find in artificial snow versus natural snow, and therefore is it as safe and as forgivable to fall on? And there are also many questions about sustainability of the Winter Olympics when the climate is changing.
Artificial snow can be bad for the environment for a number of reasons. From an energy standpoint, it's enormously energy intensive to produce snow. There's also the water question. So for Beijing, 49 million gallons of water are being used to produce the snow, and that's assuming it goes well. So if anything goes wrong or it gets a little warm, it's going to be more than that. And then there's the question of additives as well, right? So when you are making artificial snow, typically in order to keep it in good condition, you have to add certain chemical additives. And those are being introduced to the biome that's not expecting that kind of pesticide, essentially, or herbicide type product into the system. Climate change, we've seen it already erode the season length. So we've lost about 30 days on both sides of the Atlantic since the 70s in the winter season. And moving forward, we are expecting to lose more days of snow.
In their defence, the organisers of these games point out that they are reusing some of the venues from the Summer Olympics that the Chinese capital hosted back in 2008. And of course, there are the usual offsetting measures, carbon limiting measures to try to make sure that the footprint of the games is as small as it can be. So electric and hydrogen vehicles are just one of the very common themes that we now see at major sporting events. But more long term, there are far-reaching questions for winter sports as to the threat that they face from a changing climate and how the Winter Games and other events adapt to try to make sure that they grow participation, which is one of their core objectives, but also remain sustainable.
Now, some of the day's other climate news, and Thailand's Navy is working to clean up as much as 160,000 litres of oil that leaked from a pipeline. The spill is near an industrial area in the Gulf of Thailand, but authorities have warned that if the slick isn't contained, oil could reach beaches by Friday. Star Petroleum said the leak began at around 9 p.m. local time on Tuesday and was stopped shortly after midnight. At least 100,000 unnecessary ghost flights could be flown across Europe in order for airlines to keep their takeoff and landing runway rights. According to analysis by Greenpeace, empty planes could generate up to 2.1 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions. Due to the pandemic, the European Commission had cut the threshold for airlines to keep their slots from 80% to 25%. In December, that was up to 50% and will rise to 64% in March. 67% of secondary school teachers say climate change is not taught in a meaningful and relevant way that will prepare students for the effects of the climate emergency. Ahead of MPs voting on the climate education bill, the Teach the Future campaign is calling on the government for integrated, mandatory and assessed climate education across all subjects in the school curriculum, rather than just being limited to science and geography. Rihanna has pledged more than £10 million to fight climate justice. The singer, who's from Barbados, is making the donation to 18 climate justice organisations working in 7 Caribbean nations and the United States. Rihanna said the grants will focus on groups with female, LGBT and Black or Indigenous leaders due to their communities being disproportionately affected by climate change. And a big-headed frog and a Popa langur monkey are among 224 new animal and plant species that have been discovered in Southeast Asia. The WWF said a total of 155 plants, 16 fish species, 17 amphibians, 35 reptiles and 1 mammal have been found in the Great Mekong region, which spans Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand and Vietnam. Bentley has released details of its £2.5 billion sustainability programme over the next 10 years. They include the luxury car maker's first ever battery-powered vehicle, which it says will be brought to market in 2025. The company aims to become carbon neutral by 2030, making exclusively electric cars. Chairman and Chief Executive Adrian Hallmark told me he's confident the country's infrastructure will adapt.
It's true that others have been to the EV market before us, but if we operate in the luxury segment, we build big cars. And the challenge for us has been, when does the battery technology to support the kind of cars that we offer today and that we want to build for the future? And if you look at the development of battery technology, between 25 and 30 in particular, we believe now the inflection point has arrived. The battery power density is getting to where it needs to be for long distance and for high performance vehicles. And that's what we do.
For regular car drivers, many of them just find electric cars too expensive. Are electric cars always going to be the preserve of the rich, do you think?
They are more expensive, but that will change. I think if we look at the developments over the past 10 years or last 5 years, we're part of the Volkswagen Group. And if we look at the ID3, ID4 strategy and what's coming in the next phase, all of the industry is fully dedicated to drive down the cost of batteries and to get to close to parity of the cost of ownership between an electric and a non-electric car. And let's face it, even though the initial acquisition price of an electric vehicle is higher than an equivalent combustion engine vehicle, to fill up an electric vehicle at home in a 6-hour charge overnight when you're not using the car anyway is 10 to 20 pounds, depending upon the size of the car. Whereas to fill the same vehicle up with fuel would be 60 to 100 pounds. So if you multiply that over the life of the vehicle, there is a break-even point. So the total picture works. And most people will lease or finance cars anyway. So we think the combination of reduced costs together with normal financial models and the benefits of lower cost of running will, within the next 5 to 10 years, at the very latest, get to parity with today's combustion engine vehicles.
But do you think that the government could do more to make EVs more affordable?
It's very difficult because the government have lots of priorities, and we as an industry have to be competitive and create compelling offers for our customers.
And yet a lot of prospective buyers are really concerned that that charging infrastructure is just still way too patchy. Is it really up to scratch?
Today, no. But within the rate in which it's improving, and well, if we break it down, first of all, a lot of people charge the car at home. They rarely use them on the move. And so for those people that have ability to charge from home, it's already a practical alternative, as long as you're not doing regular 1,000-mile trips, which very few people are. So the infrastructure between cities is already developing and growing, but over the next 5 years, my point is, I'm confident that will grow.
Do stay tuned. Coming up here on the Daily Climate Show, I'll be joined by the director and founder of Uplift, Tessa Khan, and policy director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, Bob Ward. And we'll be asking how best to teach children about climate change and what's the future for the Winter Olympics. Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with the director and founder of Uplift, Tessa Khan, and policy director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, Bob Ward. So good evening to both of you. So, as keen viewers of our show will appreciate, climate change is a huge subject. Science, biodiversity, economics, politics, I could go on. So how can you design a curriculum that brings all those different elements into the education system without it being overwhelming? And Bob, 67% of secondary school teachers say that climate change is not taught in a meaningful and relevant way that will prepare students for the effects of the climate emergency. So how do you think that climate change should be taught? Should there be lessons just focusing on climate change, or do you think it should be infused into all the different subjects across the curriculum?
Well, climate change is currently in the national curriculum for schools in science lessons when they learn the basics of how the climate works and how man's affecting the climate, and then also in geography where they learn about things that lead to climate change, such as the energy system and how we can tackle it. So it's already embedded in the national curriculum, but the question is should it be included in other lessons? And there are ways, of course, in which you can include climate change, say in English, by asking pupils to write essays about climate change, their own experience, for instance. There's a lot of books around now, both non-fiction and fiction about climate change that you could have students listening to. You could design mathematics problems that use climate examples. So there are ways of embedding it. But the most important thing is if you're going to add further things into the national curriculum, most teachers say, well, we already have a lot in there. What would we take out? And that would be very, very difficult.
Yeah, that is a problem, isn't it, Tessa? There's so much that children do need to learn about. Do you try and inject climate change into English lessons, as Bob suggests, or into politics lessons, into lessons about business? It covers so many different areas, doesn't it? What's your answer?
Yeah, that's right, Anna. And I think, as we've heard from the stories on your programme tonight, there is no aspect of our life that, will not be touched by climate change. So it makes sense to integrate it across a range of subjects. And I have to say, I really admire the Teach for Future campaign and the leadership that, once again, young people in the UK are showing on the issue of how to address the climate crisis, how to prepare for it. But I think, ultimately, the hard truth of the matter is that by the time those young people are in positions of real power, real political power, where they can make the decisions that need to be made to keep, climate change to a safe level, that moment will have passed. And what we need are the adults in the room today, the people who are in power, our governments, the political decision makers, to actually do everything that they can to keep warming to below that critical threshold of 1.5 degrees and not leave it to young people to continue to shoulder the responsibility for this crisis. And we just haven't seen that, from this government, which is distracted by crises of its own making when we are dealing with a climate emergency and when the solutions to that, namely reducing greenhouse gas emissions, getting off fossil fuels, are so clear.
Yeah, and we could go into a whole different conversation, couldn't we, about that, and the government saying we've got some of the best targets in the world as far as emissions are concerned. But let's stick to education if we can. And Bob, I mean, how do you teach climate change without scaring children?
Well, that's an important question. You want people to be empowered by the knowledge, and they play a very important role at the moment. I know that in many families, it is the children and what they're learning, not just in school lessons, but also learning themselves. They are the drivers of understanding in families at the moment and getting changes in their parents. In fact, one of the most powerful lobbies I know in the world are young female students who are in particular targeting their fathers or mothers who are in senior positions in business and telling them you have to take this seriously. So I think it's very, very important. But people need to understand that this is a living subject and people need to feel empowered to do. Okay. They want to know what to do.
And a very quick thought from you, Tessa, on this issue of, some of the pictures we see on our screen, some of the projections and the warnings are quite scary. We have to handle the subject very delicately, don't we, with younger people?
Well, I mean, Anna, again, the fact is that, as was demonstrated by a study that was published in The Lancet late last year, what is really driving anxiety among young people is not the facts of climate change per se. It's the sense of betrayal that they feel that governments aren't taking the action that's needed, even though governments have acknowledged that we are in a climate emergency. So if we really care about the mental health of young people, we need to focus on acting and, acting at the scale and pace that's required, not running away from the problem.
OK. Let's move on to our next subject, shall we? And the Winter Games in China will rely entirely on artificial snow. And a study this week showed that only one of the last 21 Winter Olympics venues, that's Sapporo in Japan, will be suitable to host the event in future if global warming continues on its current trends. So how can Winter Games adapt to a changing climate? Tessa, rising temperatures then are going to have a real impact on host cities of the Olympic Games, the Winter Games in future. But how much does it matter? I mean, if you can import snow or rely on artificial snow, is that the end of the world?
Well, I think, this research is just another way of illustrating this problem, which, as I said, is that there is no aspect of our lives that won't be touched by climate change if we don't get it under control. And I think that research demonstrates that on our current trajectory, there won't be anywhere in the world that can actually host a Winter Olympics and provide safe, sustainable conditions for athletes. But, that's, as I said, one example. We also in the UK already know that communities here are experiencing more, increased intense flooding, for example, also a result of climate change. And we can't adapt our way out of these impacts if we are reaching, levels of climate change that are dangerous, which is the trajectory that we're on now. We've got to just address the root cause of the problem, which is greenhouse gas emissions, which are overwhelmingly being driven by fossil fuels. And, the UK is the second largest oil and gas producer in Europe. We've got to move away from those fossil fuels if we're going to ensure that we not only have a Winter Olympics, but that we have a livable climate more broadly.
Bob, do you think that future sporting events like this are under threat? Do you think that skiing is under threat given global warming and the Beijing relying almost entirely on artificial snow? It's going to use an estimated 49 million gallons of water. I mean, what are the implications in the future?
Well, the difficult thing is that most of the resorts and places where people currently go for winter sports, they are relatively low levels, and they're there because they want to be connected to make it easy for people to arrive. So the only way you're really going to be able to find ways of doing winter sports with natural snow is to move into places that are less accessible, higher up mountain ranges, further into the mountain ranges. But that would be a huge undertaking. You can't build a ski resort and winter sports venues so easily, but that's where we might go. We have to go move up in the mountain ranges, and of course that then increases the risks of things like altitudes, dealing with the effects of altitude. So there's no quick fix. This is just another example, as Tessa is saying, of the long-term consequences of the fact that the Earth is warming, and we have to deal with the consequences.
Yeah, and Tessa, does news like this, when you're talking about the Winter Games, does it actually get the message across to people in a way that perhaps some other warnings on climate change don't, when they can see a warning about the future of the Olympics?
Yeah, I think it does insofar as, the Olympics are the kind of universal cultural event that no matter where you live, you've heard about, you probably tune into, and the thought that after so many decades, it may simply cease to exist because we haven't gotten the climate crisis under control is, I think, a way of making that quite tangible. Okay. But it is, again, only the tip of the, proverbial iceberg in terms of the huge impacts that the climate crisis is going to cause if we don't get serious about addressing its root causes.
OK, well, we must leave it there. But Tessa Khan, Bob Ward, always interesting to get your take on things. Thanks very much indeed for tonight. And just to let you know that tomorrow I'll be joined by climate researcher in the application of artificial intelligence to climate change and founder of Climate in Colour, Joycelyn Longdon, and senior associate at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, Richard Black. But for now, that's it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.